There is a ghost in the Vatican. She doesn't haunt the shadowy catacombs or the silent halls of the Apostolic Palace. Instead, she haunts the very ink and parchment of history itself. For over 1,000 years, the most powerful institution on earth has tried to burn her memory, scratch her name from the records, and bury her existence under 53 miles of secret shelving. They want you to believe she never existed. They want you to believe that for 2 millennia, the throne of St. Peter has been occupied only by men. But history has a way of bleeding through the bandage of censorship. Between the reign of Pope Leo IV and Benedict III, there is a silence, a gap, a jagged edge in the timeline that the Vatican's official records, the Annuario Pontificio, tries to smooth over with a lie. For centuries, the people of Rome whispered a different name, John Anglicus, a brilliant scholar, a master of theology, and a man who was elected by acclaim to lead the entire Christian world. There was only one problem. John Anglicus was a woman. Her name was Joan. Before we descend into the mud and blood of the 9th century to find her, ask yourself, why is the Church so afraid of this story? If you're ready to uncover the truths they tried to erase, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. We are diving into the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, and you won't want to miss what we've found in the forbidden archives. Imagine a world where the sun barely broke through the clouds of superstition. In the mid-800s, the Roman Empire was a crumbling memory. The Vikings were screaming across the northern coasts, and in the heart of Rome, a woman accomplished the impossible. She didn't just survive, she conquered. Joan reigned for 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days. She dispensed sacraments, ordained bishops, and ruled with an intellect that left the most learned men of her age in awe. But if she never existed, if she is merely a Protestant myth, as the modern Church claims, for over half a millennium, the papal processions through the streets of Rome took a long, deliberate, and highly inconvenient detour. They avoided one specific narrow street near the Colosseum. Why? Because that was the spot where the legend says the earth opened up and swallowed her shame. And then, there is the chair, the Sella Stercoraria. We will soon examine the terrifying and humiliating ritual that every newly elected pope had to endure for centuries, a physical examination of his genitals to ensure he was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a man. If Joan was a myth, why was this gender check mandatory for every successor of Peter? The erasure of Joan wasn't just a simple edit. It was damnatio memoriae, the total destruction of a person's legacy. We see it in the Chronica Universalis by Jean de Mailly, where pages regarding the mid-9th century were mysteriously altered. We see it in the works of Martin of Opava, the personal chaplain to the popes, who had access to records we are still forbidden to see today. Joan was a threat, not just because of her gender, but because she proved that the entire structure of the feudal world, a world built on the supposed spiritual inferiority of women, was a fragile illusion. If a woman could be the vicar of Christ, then every king, every lord, and every priest held power that was built on sand. As we peel back the layers of Vatican censorship, we find clues hidden in plain sight. Her image carved into the pillars of great cathedrals, statues that were suddenly re-identified as someone else, ancient manuscripts where her name was scraped away with a knife, leaving only a ghostly indentation on the page. She is the forbidden pope, the woman who became God's representative on earth and paid the ultimate price for her brilliance. To understand her rise, we must first go back to where it all began. The mud of Ingelheim, Germany, and a young girl who realized that in the Dark Ages, a book was more dangerous than a sword. Was she a real historical figure, or a cautionary tale designed to keep women in their place? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Is the Vatican hiding the truth, or is this the ultimate medieval conspiracy? I'll be responding to the most intriguing theories. To understand the audacity of Joan, you must first understand the world that tried to crush her. Forget the stone castles and chivalrous knights of the later Middle Ages. The 9th century, the era of Joan, was a primordial soup of mud, blood, and fanatical superstition. This was the Dark Ages, in its purest, most literal form. Rome, once the shining marble capital of the world, was a rotting carcass, its ancient monuments stripped for lime, and its population huddled in ruins. Europe was a fractured mosaic of warring tribes, and over it all, like a suffocating blanket, lay the monolithic power of the medieval church. But in this world, there was a hierarchy as rigid as the iron swords of the Vikings. At the top was God. Below him, the Pope. Then the kings, the lords, the priests, the peasants, and the livestock. And somewhere, far below the livestock, were the women. In the year 818, the year Joan was born in the small German town of Ingelheim, a woman was not a person. She was a vessel, a piece of property passed from father to husband like a sack of grain. To the church fathers, a woman was Janua Diaboli, the gate of the devil. They looked back at Eve and the Garden of Eden and saw a permanent stain on the female soul. Tertullian, one of the early architects of Christian thought, called women the deserter of the divine law. St. Augustine whispered that nothing so casts down the manly mind from its heights as the fondling of women. This wasn't just theology, it was the law of the land. A woman could not own property. She could not testify in court. She could not speak in church. And most importantly, she was strictly, under pain of sin and physical punishment, forbidden from the light of education. To teach a girl to read in the 9th century was considered as absurd and as dangerous as teaching a dog to speak. Knowledge was power, and power belonged to the men of God. But in a small, damp hut in Ingelheim, a young girl was watching. She was watching her father, a cold and devout missionary, study the sacred texts. She was watching her brother struggle with his letters, and in the dark of night, she was doing something that could get her killed. She was learning. Imagine the atmosphere of Joan's childhood. Ingelheim was a frontier town, a place of freezing winters and constant fear of pagan raids. The church was the only source of order, but it was an order enforced with the lash. Her father, an Englishman who had come to Germany to convert the Saxons, saw his daughter not as a gift, but as a burden. To him, Joan was a mouth to feed and a potential source of shame. But Joan was an anomaly. While other girls were taught to weave and keep silent, Joan's mind was a wildfire. She possessed what the medieval world feared most in a woman, a logical, piercing intellect. She realized early on that the divine order she was told to obey was built on a single, massive lie, the lie that her mind was inferior because of her body. Every time she saw a monk with a manuscript, every time she heard the Latin chants echoing in the cold air, she felt a pull, a hunger, not for bread, but for the forbidden fruit of the word. But how does a girl in a mud-caked village in the heart of Germany escape the destiny of a peasant wife? How does she cross the barrier from the gate of the devil to the vicar of Christ? In the 9th century, the church had a monopoly on the soul. If you wanted to learn, you had to be a part of the church. But the church was a fortress with no doors for women. To enter, Joan would have to do more than just study. She would have to commit the ultimate sacrilege. She would have to kill Joan and create someone else. The air in Ingelheim was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of bells. It was a world where a woman's life was defined by the biological cycles of birth and death, usually ending in the agony of a botched labor or the slow rot of poverty. Joan saw her mother's exhausted eyes. She saw the women of her village broken by the age of 25. She knew that if she stayed, her mind would be buried long before her body. It was here, in the shadows of the Dark Ages, that the first seeds of the greatest deception in history were planted. A plan so daring, so dangerous, that it required a level of courage most men of her time couldn't fathom. But before she could become John Anglicus, she had to endure a trial by fire. She had to navigate the treacherous waters of a family that saw her as a servant, and a society that saw her as a sin. In the next part of our journey, we witness the moment of transformation. We see the exact day Joan decided that she would rather live as a dead man than die as a living woman. We will see the blood, the shears, and the first time she looked in a reflection and saw the face of a priest looking back. Can you imagine the terror of that first night in disguise? One slip of the tongue, one wrong movement, and the punishment would be public, brutal, and final. If you're captivated by Joan's defiance against this dark world, make sure you're subscribed. In the next chapter, we're following Joan as she steps out of the shadows and begins her journey toward Rome. Imagine a child who is a threat to the world simply by breathing, not because of a sword she carries, but because of a thought she holds. In the year 822, in the mud-slicked village of Ingelheim, a young girl named Joan was committing a crime every single day. She was listening, she was remembering, and she was understanding things that even the most devout monks in her father's mission could not grasp. In the eyes of the 9th century, Joan was a biological mistake. In the eyes of God, according to the men of her time, she was a silent servant. But in reality, Joan was a prodigy, a supernova of intellect trapped in a dark, cold corner of Germany. Ingelheim was a place of harsh survival. Her father, Gerald, was an English missionary, a man of iron faith and a heart of stone. He had come to these Germanic lands to beat the paganism out of the Saxons and replace it with the Latin word. To him, his sons were his legacy. They were the ones who would carry the cross. His daughter Joan was merely a mouth to feed until she could be sold into a marriage that would benefit his standing. But Gerald had a problem. His eldest son, John, was struggling. "Amo, amas, amat," the boy would stumble, his voice trembling in the flickering candlelight of their hut. To John, Latin was a cage of strange sounds and impossible grammar. He was a kind boy, but his mind was not built for the abstract complexities of theology. But behind the loom, or while stirring the gray pottage over the hearth, Joan was reciting the words in her head. She didn't just hear the sounds, she saw the structure. She understood the logic of the language, as if it were a song she had known before birth. While her brother wept over his primers, Joan was mentally soaring through the works of St. Augustine and the Roman poets. But a girl who knows Latin in the 9th century is not a scholar. She is a target. If her father found out, it wouldn't just be a scolding. It would be an exorcism. He believed that a woman's brain was too soft for logic. If a girl understood the scriptures, it could only be because a demon was whispering in her ear. Joan's childhood became a high-stakes game of intellectual espionage. She learned to read by catching glimpses of her father's precious manuscripts over his shoulder. She memorized the shape of letters by tracing them in the cold mud outside the church, while the villagers thought she was merely playing. She was a ghost in her own home. She learned to make herself invisible, to dampen the light in her eyes so that her father wouldn't see the fire of intelligence burning there. She became a master of the submissive silence that the church demanded of her gender, using it as a shield to protect the treasure growing inside her mind. One evening, a visiting scholar, a man from the great schools of the South, stopped at their mission. He spoke of the liberal arts, of logic, rhetoric, and the forbidden philosophies of the Greeks. As he debated with her father, the scholar made a subtle error in a Greek translation. Gerald didn't notice. John didn't notice. But in the shadows of the corner, Joan felt the correction rise in her throat like a physical force. It was the first time the mask nearly slipped. She gripped the edge of her wooden bowl so hard her knuckles turned white. The agony of having the answer and being forbidden from speaking it was a torture far worse than any physical lash. It was in that moment that Joan realized the true nature of her prison. It wasn't the mud of Ingelheim or the cold of the winters. It was the silence. If she remained Joan, she would spend the rest of her life as a spectator to a world she was meant to lead. She saw her future, a life of domestic drudgery, the slow erasure of her mind, and an early grave. But then, tragedy struck. A tragedy that would provide the most horrific opportunity imaginable. A fever swept through the mission. It didn't care about gender or potential. It took the weak and the strong alike. In the span of 3 days, Joan's brother John, the boy she had spent years secretly teaching, the boy who was her only bridge to the world of men, lay dead. As Joan stood over her brother's body, she saw more than just a loss. She saw a vacancy. Her father was devastated, not just by the loss of a son, but by the loss of his successor. The mission needed a John. The world expected a John. Looking down at her brother's cold, still face, a thought occurred to Joan that was both blasphemous and brilliant. The resemblance between them was striking, with his hair cut short and his heavy wool tunics. Who would know? If Joan died and John lived, the world would remain in balance. Would you have the courage to bury your own identity to save your soul? Joan was about to commit the ultimate fraud, a deception that would lead her to the throne of God. If you want to see how she transformed herself and took her first steps out of the mud of Germany, click that like button and stay tuned. The next chapter is where the legend truly begins. She didn't hesitate. While her father was buried in his grief and the village was distracted by the plague, Joan took a pair of rusted shears. One by one, her long, dark tresses fell into the dirt. With every cut, she felt a weight lifting. She wasn't just cutting hair, she was cutting ties. She was severing the tether that bound her to the loom and the hearth. When she was finished, she looked into a bucket of rainwater. The girl was gone. In her place stood a thin, pale boy with sharp, observant eyes. She donned her brother's rough wool tunic, the fabric scratching against her skin, a constant reminder of the lie she was now living. From that day forward, she would never speak as Joan again. She was John Anglicus. She was a scholar. She was a survivor. But as she walked out of the hut, she knew that the smallest mistake, a high-pitched laugh, a slip of a tunic, the start of a monthly cycle, would lead to a stake and a fire. The prodigy of Ingelheim was dead. The long game for the papacy had begun. The girl was buried in a shallow grave of discarded hair and old wool. As the sun rose over the mist-shrouded fields of Ingelheim, the creature that walked away from the village didn't have a past, a home, or a gender. It had only a mission. But Joan, now John Anglicus, was about to learn that a mask is not just something you wear on your face. It is something that must grow into your skin, your voice, and your very soul. One slip of the tongue, one accidental touch, one monthly cycle. In the year 830, these weren't just embarrassments. They were death warrants. Walking away from her father's mission was the easiest part. The hard part was the silence. Joan had to relearn how to breathe, how to walk with a heavier gait, and how to lower the pitch of a voice that was naturally melodic. She practiced in the woods, shouting into the wind until her throat was raw, trying to find that gravelly resonance that the world associated with authority. She joined a group of traveling Benedictine monks heading south. To them, she was just another pale, grieving youth looking for God in the aftermath of the plague. They saw a boy with a frail frame, but eyes that held the wisdom of an old man. They called her Brother John. Every time the word brother hit her ears, it was like a physical blow, a reminder of the brother she had lost and the lie she was now breathing. Life in a 9th century monastery was a masterpiece of communal living, and for Joan, it was a biological minefield. There was no privacy. Monks slept in shared dormitories, prayed together in the freezing pre-dawn hours, and ate in silence while listening to scripture. How do you hide a changing body in a world where you are never alone? How do you mask the onset of womanhood when your brothers are always watching? Joan became a master of holy asceticism. She volunteered for the late-night vigils, staying awake in the cold chapel long after the others had gone to sleep. This gave her the precious moments of solitude she needed to tend to her secret. She learned to bind her chest with strips of rough linen, pulling them so tight she could barely draw breath, a self-inflicted penance that left her ribs bruised and her skin scarred. But the biggest threat wasn't the external world. It was her own biology. Nature does not care for disguises. When the first signs of her monthly cycle appeared, Joan was paralyzed with terror. In the medieval mind, blood was sacred or cursed. For a monk to bleed without a wound was a sign of the devil. She had to hide the evidence with the desperation of a murderer cleaning a crime scene. She used the cold water of the well in the dead of night, scrubbing her tunics until her fingers bled, praying to a God she wasn't sure would still listen to her. She turned this fear into fuel. To distract the monks from her body, she gave them her mind. John Anglicus became the most dedicated student the Benedictines had ever seen. While the other monks struggled to stay awake during the matins, John was already in the scriptorium, his quill moving with a ferocity that bordered on madness. He mastered Greek, he debated the finer points of Aristotelian logic, and he memorized the Psalter in weeks. The monks began to whisper about this English youth. They didn't see a woman. They saw a saint in the making. They saw a man so devoted to God that he had transcended the needs of the flesh. They mistook her frailty for fasting, her silence for humility, and her lack of a beard for the purity of a young eunuch. But the psychological toll was devastating. Joan lived in a state of permanent hypervigilance. Every laugh had to be checked. Every gesture had to be calculated. She was living a double life where the actor could never take off the costume, even in sleep. She was John in the light, and a terrified, lonely girl in the dark. The split in her psyche grew deeper. She began to view Joan as a ghost, a twin sister who had died in the mud of Ingelheim. Only John existed now, but John was a hollow shell, held together by the sheer force of an iron will and a hunger for the knowledge that lay further south. Rome was the goal. But the road to Rome was long, and it was filled with eyes. Do you think you could live every second of your life as a lie, knowing that one mistake would lead to your execution? Tell me in the comments, would you choose a life of safety in the shadows or a life of power in a disguise? Your engagement helps us bring these hidden stories to light. After 3 years, the monastery was no longer enough. John Anglicus had outlearned his masters. The abbot, a man who saw in John the future of the church, recommended him for a journey to the great center of learning, Athens. For Joan, Athens was a dream. It was the land of Plato and Socrates, a place where the mind was celebrated. But it was also a dangerous step closer to the ultimate seat of power. As she prepared to leave the safety of the monastery walls, she looked at the heavy iron gates. She was leaving behind the only protection she had. She was heading into the heart of the Mediterranean, where the sun was brighter and the people were more observant. Her disguise had held in the damp cold of Germany, but would it survive the heat of Greece and the scrutiny of the world's greatest scholars? She tightened the linen bandages around her chest, threw a rough traveler's cloak over her shoulders, and stepped out onto the Roman road. She wasn't just a monk anymore. She was an intellectual predator, heading toward the light of the East, carrying a secret that was getting heavier with every step. Athens was waiting, but in the shadows of the Parthenon, Joan would find more than just books. She would find the first real challenge to her heart, a challenge that would threaten to tear the mask of John Anglicus right off her face. Athens in the 9th century was a city of ghosts. The golden age of Pericles and Plato was 1,000 years in the past, and the Parthenon stood as a weathered skeleton against the piercing blue of the Mediterranean sky. But to a girl from the mud-caked forests of Germany, this was the center of the universe. For Joan, now firmly entrenched in the identity of John Anglicus, Athens wasn't just a city, it was an armory, a place to gather the intellectual weapons she would need to storm the gates of Rome. In Athens, she would learn that logic is a sharper blade than any sword, and that a woman's mind, when fueled by the fire of forbidden philosophy, could outshine the brightest stars of the church. The journey from the Benedictine monastery to Greece was a brutal transition. The heat was a physical weight, and the light, so different from the gray mists of Ingelheim, seemed to peel away her layers of deception. Joan felt exposed. In the cramped quarters of the trading vessels, she had to navigate the proximity of sailors and merchants with the calculated coldness of a professional spy. When she finally set foot in Athens, she disappeared into the world of the scholae. These were the last remnants of the great classical academies, now operating under the wary eye of the Byzantine Church. Here, John Anglicus became a sensation. While the other students, sons of wealthy Frankish lords or Byzantine bureaucrats, spent their afternoons in the taverns, John lived in the libraries. He didn't just learn Greek, he inhaled it. He began to translate the original texts of the New Testament, realizing with a start that the Latin versions used in the West were riddled with the errors of tired monks. But as her intellect grew, so did the danger. In Athens, scholarship was a social sport. Scholars debated in public squares, dined together, and, most dangerously, bathed together. The gymnasium was the heart of Greek intellectual life, a place where men shared ideas in a state of physical openness that was Joan's worst nightmare. How did she survive the scrutiny of the baths? How did she avoid the intimate camaraderie of the Scholars Guild? Joan leaned into a new persona, the holy aesthetic. She cultivated an image of such extreme, fanatical purity that even the most secular students felt ashamed in her presence. She claimed a vow of physical mortification, refusing to uncover her body even in private, whispering of a terrifying penance she had taken upon herself in the Holy Land. She became a pillar of marble, cold, untouchable, and brilliant. Imagine being the smartest person in the room, but having to hide the very thing that makes you human. If you find Joan's strategic genius as fascinating as her survival skills, make sure to like this video. We're exploring how she used her mind to bypass the physical barriers of her world. In Athens, Joan found her first real intellectual match, a philosopher named Leontius. He was an old man, his eyes clouded by cataracts, but his mind as sharp as a diamond. He took John under his wing, fascinated by the young Englishman's grasp of Aristotelian logic. But Leontius saw things that others missed. He noticed the way John's hands were small and delicate, despite the ink stains. He noticed that John never grew the philosopher's beard that was the pride of the academy. One evening, under the shade of an ancient olive grove, Leontius turned to her and said, "You have a soul that does not match your skin, John Anglicus. You speak of God like a lover, and of logic like a mother protecting her child." Joan felt her heart stop. Was this it? Was the mask finally crumbling under the gaze of a blind old man? She didn't panic. She used the very logic Leontius had taught her. She spun a web of theological justification, speaking of the androgyny of the soul in the eyes of Christ. She turned the conversation into a high-level debate on the nature of existence, distracting the mentor with his own love for complexity. Leontius didn't push further. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he simply didn't care, recognizing that a mind this beautiful was a gift to the world, regardless of the vessel that carried it. From Leontius, Joan learned the final, most important lesson. The world sees what it expects to see. If you act like a master, they will treat you as one. If you speak with the authority of God, they will never look at your feet to see if they are small. By the time she was 25, John Anglicus was the most famous student in Athens. Her reputation had crossed the Adriatic. Rumors began to reach the ears of the Curia in Rome about a young scholar of incomparable brilliance, a man who spoke 5 languages and could solve the most complex theological puzzles with a single sentence. But Athens was a cage of gold. It was a place of theory, not power. And Joan knew that if she wanted to truly change the world, if she wanted to ensure that no other girl would ever have to bury her name in the mud, she had to go to the heart of the beast. She had to go to Rome. But Rome in the 9th century was not just a city of prayer. It was a city of blood, poison, and deep-seated misogyny. It was the lion's den. As she prepared her departure, she looked at the Parthenon one last time. She was leaving the light of knowledge for the darkness of power. She was about to enter the most scrutinized court in the world, where the Pope's physicians and the sharp-eyed eunuchs of the palace would be her constant companions. Rome is the ultimate test. Do you think Joan's holy aesthetic act will hold up in the den of vipers that was the 9th century Vatican? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I'm curious to see who thinks her intellect was enough to fool the most suspicious men in history. She boarded a ship bound for Ostia, the port of Rome. In her chest, she carried her brother's old tunic and a collection of rare Greek manuscripts. She was no longer the terrified girl who had cut her hair in a hut. She was a scholar of international standing. As the shores of Greece faded into the horizon, Joan tightened the bandages around her chest. The heat of Athens had taught her to endure. The logic of Leontius had taught her to deceive. But as the Italian coast appeared like a low, gray cloud on the water, a new sensation took hold of her. Ambition. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was hunting. The throne of St. Peter was waiting, and John Anglicus was coming to claim it. The light of Greece was a clean, intellectual fire. But the air of Rome? The air of Rome tasted of incense, open sewers, and ancient, rotting power. In the year 848, as the ship carrying John Anglicus docked at the port of Ostia, Joan looked toward the horizon and saw the silhouette of the Seven Hills. This was the city that claimed to hold the keys to heaven, but was currently drowning in the filth of earth. She wasn't just a scholar anymore. She was a Trojan horse, a woman carrying a secret that could burn the Vatican to the ground, stepping directly into the most dangerous court in the Western world. Rome in the mid-9th century was not the city of marble we imagine today. It was a sprawling graveyard of a lost civilization. The great aqueducts were broken, leaking water into stagnant marshes that bred malaria. The Colosseum was a fortress for bandits. Families lived in the ruins of pagan temples, cooking their meager meals over fires fueled by ancient wooden statues. But in the center of this decay stood the Leonine city, the fortified heart of the papacy. As John Anglicus walked through the gate of San Pellegrino, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her bound chest. Every priest, every monk, and every soldier of the papal guard was a potential executioner. In Athens, her brilliance was a curiosity. In Rome, it was a threat. The Roman Curia was a den of vipers, men who had spent their lives perfecting the arts of poison, simony, and the slow, quiet assassination of a rival's reputation. Joan knew she couldn't hide in a library here. To survive Rome, she had to be seen. She had to become indispensable. But Rome had a way of sniffing out outsiders. The Roman clergy looked down on anyone who wasn't born in the shadow of the Vatican. How could an Englishman from the German frontier, via the schools of Athens, hope to penetrate the inner circle of Pope Leo IV? Rome is where the stakes change from survival to dominance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the political shadows of the Vatican, make sure to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real history, the messy, dangerous kind, is what you want to see. She took a room in a modest pilgrim's hostel near St. Peter's Basilica. She spent her first weeks observing. She watched the way the cardinals walked, the subtle tilt of a head, the way a ring was offered to be kissed. She realized that in Rome, theology was just a costume that power wore. Her grand debut came at the Schola Cantorum. It was a gathering of the city's most arrogant theologians, men who thought they knew everything because they lived closest to the tombs of the apostles. John Anglicus walked in, carrying a rare Greek manuscript she had brought from Athens, a text on the nature of the Trinity that the Romans had only heard of in whispers. She didn't wait to be invited to speak. She challenged the lead scholar on a point of translation. The room went silent. Who was this pale, beardless youth with the piercing eyes and the strange melodic accent? The debate lasted 6 hours. Joan didn't just defend her position. She dismantled her opponents with the cold, surgical logic she had learned from Leontius. She quoted the Greek fathers from memory. She cross-referenced the Hebrew scriptures with the Latin Vulgate. She moved through the complexities of the faith like a master chess player. By sunset, the arrogant Roman priests were stunned. They had never heard anything like it. This wasn't just learning, it was a divine fire. Word began to spread through the Leonine city like a contagion. There is an Englishman among us, a new Augustine, a man who speaks with the tongue of angels and the mind of Aristotle. The whispers eventually reached the Lateran Palace. Pope Leo IV was a man of action, a soldier pope who was currently obsessed with building the great walls of Rome to keep out the Saracen pirates. But Leo was also a man who knew he was surrounded by fools and sycophants. He needed a brilliant mind to handle the mounting paperwork of the church, someone who wasn't tied to the warring Roman noble families. He summoned John Anglicus. This was the moment of maximum peril. The Pope's inner sanctum was staffed by physicians and chamberlains who were experts at reading the human body. To stand before the Vicar of Christ was to be scrutinized by the most suspicious eyes in the world. Joan prepared herself. She tightened her bandages until she felt faint. She darkened the skin under her eyes to look like a man exhausted by prayer and study. When she finally knelt before Leo IV, she didn't look like a woman. She looked like a saint who had forgotten he had a body at all. Leo didn't ask her about her past. He didn't ask about her family. He threw a complex legal dispute regarding the monasteries of Gaul at her. Joan answered without hesitation, citing precedents from 3 centuries of canon law. Leo smiled, a rare sight in those dark days. "You have the mind of a giant in the body of a boy, Anglicus," the Pope remarked. That afternoon, John Anglicus was appointed as a scriba, a papal secretary. It was a meteoric rise. In a matter of weeks, she had moved from a pilgrim's hostel to the very heart of the Vatican's bureaucracy. She was now handling the Pope's private correspondence. She was drafting the decrees that would govern millions of souls. But the closer she got to the sun, the more she risked being burned. Imagine the stress. Every meal shared with the Pope, every late-night session over maps and scrolls was a chance for her secret to slip. Do you think you could keep your composure while the most powerful man in the world looked you in the eye? Let me know in the comments. Is Leo IV's favor her greatest shield, or her most dangerous trap? Success in Rome came with a shadow. The Roman nobility, specifically the families who saw the papacy as their private property, began to hate the English upstart. They watched her. They followed her. They looked for a weakness. Joan had to be perfect. She became the most ascetic man in the Vatican. She never drank wine. She never attended the lavish banquets of the cardinals. She claimed a ailment of the stomach that required her to eat alone in her small chambers. She became a shadow that moved only between the library and the Pope's side. But the physical strain was beginning to show. The binding of her chest was causing chronic pain. The lack of sleep from her constant vigilance was hollowing out her cheeks. She was winning the war of the mind, but her body was starting to scream for mercy. And then there was the heat. The Roman summer of 849 was a brutal, humid monster. In the stagnant air of the palace, the smell of her own sweat terrified her. She lived in constant fear that the scent of a woman would betray her to the sharp-nosed eunuchs who guarded the corridors. One day, while working in the archives, a young deacon, a man known for his beauty and his curiosity, approached her. He leaned in close, his breath on her neck, and whispered, "You work too hard, Brother John. Your skin is as pale as marble and as soft." Joan didn't flinch. She turned, her eyes cold and dead, and rebuked him with a scripture about the lust of the eyes and the vanity of the flesh. She used her holiness as a weapon to drive him back. It worked. The deacon retreated, red-faced with shame. But as she watched him walk away, Joan's hands shook. The mask was holding, but the person behind it was beginning to crumble. She was at the center of the world, but she was more alone than she had been in the mud of Ingelheim. She was now the Pope's most trusted advisor. She was the shadow Pope before she ever wore the ring. But the higher she climbed, the further she had to fall. And in Rome, the fall usually ended in blood. As the months turned into years, John Anglicus became more than the Pope's secretary. She became his memory. She was given the keys to the Scrinium, the ancient document room of the Lateran. In these damp, lightless vaults, Joan found things that weren't in the official Bibles. She read the forged donation of Constantine, sensing the cracks in the Church's legal claims to land. She saw the true accounts of the papal treasury, realizing that while the city starved, the gold of the faithful was being diverted into the pockets of Roman barons. Knowledge was her armor. Every secret she uncovered was a shield she could use against her enemies. She began to manage the unmanageable. When the Saracen pirates threatened the coast of Ostia, it was John Anglicus who drafted the strategic alliances with the Frankish lords. When the Roman families fought in the streets, it was John who negotiated the delicate truces. She was a ghost in the machine of God, unseen, unheard, but absolutely essential. But the physical cost was a mounting debt. In the stifling heat of the Roman summers, Joan lived in a state of constant, low-grade fever. The heavy wool robes she wore to hide her shape became a portable furnace. Her skin, once healthy and sun-kissed from Greece, turned a ghostly, translucent gray. The cardinals began to call her the marble monk. They thought her paleness was a sign of divine holiness, a body being consumed by the fire of the Spirit. They had no idea it was the sign of a woman slowly suffocating under the weight of a 1,000-year-old lie. If you were in Joan's shoes, would you use those Vatican secrets for good or for your own survival? The line between the two was starting to blur for her. Tell me in the comments, does power corrupt the soul, or does it simply reveal who you really are? By the year 852, Pope Leo IV was aging. His health was failing, and the vultures of Rome were already circling the throne. But there was a problem. None of the Roman candidates had the support of the people. None of them had the intellect of the Englishman. Joan had played the game so perfectly that she had become the only logical choice for the future. She had transcended her gender, her nationality, and her past. She had become an institution. But as she looked at the dying pope, she realized that the Vicar of Christ was not just a title, it was a target. To step onto that throne was to invite the gaze of the entire world. The mask of John Anglicus was about to face its ultimate test, the conclave, the sound of a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat that slowly fades into the tolling of a funeral bell. The shadow she cast over Rome was long, but it was thin. One heartbeat away from glory, one heartbeat away from the abyss. The higher you climb the mountain of God, the thinner the air becomes, and the sharper the knives. By the year 850, John Anglicus was no longer a mere secretary. She had become a cardinal deacon, a prince of the church, draped in the scarlet robes that symbolized her readiness to shed blood for the faith. But the irony was a silent scream. The blood Joan feared shedding was her own, for if a single drop of her truth escaped, the scarlet of her robes would become the color of her martyrdom. She was now a member of the inner circle, the handful of men who breathed the same air as the Pope. But in the Vatican, proximity to power is just another word for proximity to death. The Lateran Palace was a labyrinth of silk and stone. To the outside world, it was the center of holiness. To Joan, it was a panopticon, Every dinner was an interrogation. Every ritual was a trap. She sat at the table with men like Cardinal Anastasius, a man born into the Roman aristocracy, a man who believed the papacy was his biological right. Anastasius was everything Joan was not: loud, physically imposing, and deeply suspicious of anyone who didn't share his bloodline. He watched John Anglicus with the eyes of a hawk. He didn't see a woman, not yet, but he saw a rival who had stolen the Pope's ear. "You eat like a bird, Anglicus," Anastasius would sneer, his breath smelling of sour wine and roasted boar. "And you speak like a Greek philosopher. Are you sure you haven't forgotten the simple, rugged faith of a Roman?" Joan's response was always a masterpiece of submissive dominance. She would lower her eyes, clasp her delicate hands, and quote a scripture that made Anastasius look like an illiterate brute. She used her holiness as a cage, trapping her enemies within the very rules they claimed to uphold. But the physical mask was fraying. The constant binding of her chest had led to a chronic cough, and the lack of sunlight in the archives had made her skin look like translucent parchment. The Roman physicians, eager to curry favor with the rising star, offered to examine her. Imagine the terror. A single touch, a single removal of a tunic, and the game would be over. How long could you look your worst enemy in the eye and pretend to be exactly who they hate? Joan was doing it every day, 24/7. If you're feeling the tension of this high-stakes deception, hit that like button. We're about to see how she turned a medical crisis into a political victory. Joan survived the physicians by turning her illness into a spiritual weapon. She claimed to be suffering from the pains of the martyrs, a divine affliction that could only be cured by solitary prayer and fasting. She made her body off limits by declaring it a vessel of holy suffering. While her rivals plotted, Joan worked. She became the Church's greatest diplomat. When the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, threatened to march on Rome, it was John Anglicus who wrote the letters that paralyzed his resolve. She played the warring factions of Europe against each other like a grandmaster playing 3 games of chess at once. She wasn't just surviving the inner circle, she was managing them. She knew which cardinal took bribes, which bishop had a secret family in the countryside, and which deacon was skimming from the Peter's pence. She held the strings of 1,000 secrets, and she pulled them with the grace of a puppeteer. But her shield was about to shatter. In July of 855, the summer heat broke Pope Leo IV. The old soldier, the man who had seen Joan as a son and a savior, lay dying in the sweltering heat of the Vatican. As Joan knelt by his bedside, the world outside was already beginning to scream. The Roman mob was rioting. The Saracens were sighted off the coast, and in the corridors of the Lateran, Anastasius was already gathering his soldiers. Leo looked at Joan, his eyes clouded by death. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her cheek. Did he know? In those final seconds, as the soul leaves the body, did the Vicar of Christ see the woman behind the mask? He whispered one final word: protect the throne. With Leo's death, the inner circle became a circle of wolves. The conclave was called. According to the laws of the time, the new pope had to be elected by the clergy and the people of Rome. Anastasius had the soldiers. He had the money. He had the right gender. But John Anglicus had something far more powerful. She had the love of the people and the secrets of the dead. The throne is vacant. The most powerful seat in the world is up for grabs. Do you think Joan should flee Rome now while she still can? Or should she double down and try to become the first female pope in history. Write, flee, or fight in the comments. The next part is the conclave, the most high-stakes election in human history. As the bells of Rome tolled for the dead pope, Joan locked herself in her chambers. She took off the heavy scarlet robes for a moment. She looked at her bruised ribs, the scars from years of binding, and the pale, trembling hands that had written the history of the world. She could leave. She could disappear into the night, find a dress, and live out her days in a convent or a quiet village. But she looked at the ring on the table, the ring of the cardinal. She thought of the little girl in the mud of Ingelheim. If she walked away, the silence would win. If she stayed, she would be the greatest lie and the greatest truth the world had ever known. She picked up the linen bandages. She pulled them tighter than she ever had before. "John Anglicus is not dead," she whispered to the empty room. "He is just beginning." The throne of St. Peter is the most dangerous seat in the world, and in July of 853, it was dripping with the sweat of 1,000 conspiracies. Pope Leo IV was barely cold in his tomb when the vultures of the Lateran began their dance. The city of Rome was a tinderbox. The Saracen pirates were raiding the coast, the common people were starving, and the noble families were sharpening their daggers. For Joan, this was the moment of total exposure. She could no longer hide behind the authority of a protector. To survive the next 48 hours, she would have to do the unthinkable. She would have to lead. She would have to step into the light and convince the world that John Anglicus was not just a scholar, but a God-chosen king. The period of sede vacante, the vacant seat, is a time of holy anarchy. Without a pope, the laws of Rome are written in blood. Cardinal Anastasius, the man they called the librarian, didn't wait for a vote. He moved his soldiers into the Leonine city, occupying the strategic bridges and whispering to the Roman barons that the time for foreign influence was over. To Anastasius, John Anglicus was an English infection that needed to be purged. Joan sat in her small, sweltering cell. The heat was a physical assault. Under her heavy wool robes, the linen bandages were soaked with sweat, chafing against her skin until she bled. Every breath was a struggle against the constriction of her chest and the mounting panic in her mind. If she lost this election, she wouldn't just be a failed candidate. She would be a dead woman. Anastasius wouldn't just exile her. He would investigate her. And in the dungeons of Rome, there were no secrets. Imagine being trapped in a room with 70 men who want you dead, knowing that your only shield is a lie you've lived for 15 years. If you're feeling the suffocating tension of this election, hit that subscribe button. We're about to witness how a woman used the power of the word to defeat the power of the sword. The clergy gathered in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, melting beeswax and ancient dust. According to the ancient rules, the Pope was chosen by acclamation, the combined voice of the clergy and the people of Rome. Anastasius spoke first. He was a master of the politics of fear. He spoke of the Saracen threat, the need for a strong Roman arm, and the danger of effeminate intellectualism. He didn't name Joan, but every eye in the room turned toward the pale, beardless Englishman sitting in the back. "We do not need a librarian to lead us into war," Anastasius roared, his voice bouncing off the mosaic ceilings. "We need a man of Roman blood, a man of iron." Joan stood up. She didn't shout. She used the Athenian voice, the low, resonant, and perfectly modulated tone she had practiced for a decade. She didn't talk about war. She talked about the soul of Rome. She spoke of Leo IV's vision, of the walls he built not just with stone, but with faith. She cited the ancient prophets, linking the survival of the city to the purity of its leader. She wasn't just speaking theology, she was performing a miracle. In a room full of tired, cynical, and frightened men, she offered something they hadn't felt in years: hope. She made them feel that by choosing her, they were choosing God's direct intervention. But the clergy were still afraid of Anastasius's soldiers. The vote was deadlocked. That was when the doors of the basilica were nearly kicked down. The people of Rome, the beggars, the widows, the shopkeepers, the very people Joan had spent years secretly helping with the Pope's charity, had gathered outside. They didn't want a nobleman. They didn't want a soldier. They wanted the holy Englishman. They began to chant a single name: Anglicus, Anglicus, John is our father. It was a landslide of human will. The cardinals, realizing that a vote for Anastasius would lead to a riot that would burn the Vatican to the ground, began to shift. One by one, they knelt. Even those who hated her were forced by the sheer gravity of the moment to acknowledge the divine choice. Do you think the people of Rome sensed something different about Joan, or were they just tired of the corrupt Roman elites? Tell me in the comments, why do you think a foreigner like John Anglicus was so much more popular than a local hero? I'll be reading your theories. Anastasius stood paralyzed, his face a mask of purple rage. His soldiers, seeing the direction of the wind, lowered their spears. The librarian had been outplayed by a scholar. The senior cardinal deacon stepped forward. He held the fisherman's ring, the symbol of the highest authority on earth. He approached the pale figure in the center of the room. "Do you accept?" the cardinal whispered. Joan felt the world tilt. For a second, the image of the little girl in Ingelheim flashed before her eyes. The girl who had stolen a book, the girl who had cut her hair in the mud. She looked at the ring. She looked at the men who would now be her servants. "Accepto," she whispered. "I accept." The cry went out from the balcony to the waiting thousands in the square. "Habemus Papam! We have a pope!" They dressed her in the white robes of the pontiff. They placed the heavy, gem-encrusted tiara on her head. As she was carried through the streets on the sedia gestatoria, the shoulder-high throne, Joan looked down at the sea of faces. They were cheering for a man who didn't exist. They were worshiping a shadow. But as the incense swirled around her and the sun of Rome beat down on her crown, a terrifying realization took hold. She had won. She was the vicar of Christ. She was the ruler of the Western world. And now she had to hide her secret from the eyes of the entire planet every single second for the rest of her life. She was the Pope. But as the coronation festivities began, a new and unexpected danger appeared. Not a soldier, not a rival, but a face from her past. Someone who knew exactly who John Anglicus used to be. The crown of St. Peter weighs 8 pounds of gold, silver, and precious stones. But for Pope John VIII, the woman the world knew as John Anglicus, the weight was far heavier. It was the weight of 1 billion souls, the weight of a 1,000-year-old lie, and the constant, suffocating pressure of being perfect. In the year 853, Joan didn't just take a seat on the throne. She became the throne. She had reached the absolute zenith of human power. From the mud of Germany to the pinnacle of Christendom, she was now the vicar of Christ. But as she looked out from the balcony of St. Peter's, she realized the terrifying truth. To remain the Pope, She had to stop being human. Most popes of the 9th century were either soldiers or puppets of the Roman aristocracy. They spent their reigns fighting wars or lining their families' pockets. But John VIII was different. She was a scholar pope, a philosopher king in a time of brutal ignorance. Joan began a massive reconstruction of Rome. She didn't just build walls, she built infrastructure. She repaired the ancient aqueducts that had been dry for a century, bringing clean water back to the thirsty slums of the city. She founded hospitals that didn't just pray for the sick, but actually used the Greek medical knowledge she had smuggled from Athens. She was a master of the soft power. While the Frankish kings were butchering each other, the English pope was mediating peace treaties. She used the Vatican's wealth not for gold altars, but for grain doles during the Great Famine of 854. To the common people of Rome, she was a living saint. They didn't care that their pope didn't have a beard. They cared that their children weren't starving. If a fake pope did more good for the world than the real ones, does the lie even matter? This is the central question of Joan's reign. If you think her achievements prove that merit should come before gender, hit that like button. We're exploring how she became the most effective leader in medieval history, but her brilliance was her greatest danger. She was too good. In the dark corners of the Lateran Palace, the displaced Roman noblemen, led by the bitter and disgraced Anastasius, were watching. They couldn't find a flaw in her theology. They couldn't find a gap in her legal decrees. She was a fortress of logic. But Anastasius, a man who understood the primitive instincts of power, began to look for the one thing Joan couldn't fake: the instincts of the flesh. He never sleeps, they would whisper. He never eats meat. He never touches wine. It is as if he is trying to outgod God himself. Joan lived in a state of permanent optical illusion. Every public mass was a performance. Every blessing was a calculation. She developed a papal walk, a slow, gliding movement that hid the sway of her hips. She wore thicker, heavier layers of silk and wool, even in the blistering Roman summer, to mask the softening curves of her body. But as the second year of her reign began, the marble monk faced a threat that no amount of logic could solve. It wasn't a spy or an assassin. It was a face from the past. His name was Arnaldo, a man who had been a low-level servant in the Benedictine monastery where Joan had first taken her vows. He was the only person alive who had seen John Anglicus in a moment of vulnerability, a moment 10 years ago when a young monk had tripped and revealed a glimpse of a bound chest. Arnaldo had followed the news of the English prodigy with a growing dark suspicion. He had traveled to Rome, working his way into the papal household as a groom. And one evening, in the flickering torchlight of the Vatican stables, their eyes met. Joan froze. In that look, she saw her childhood, her secrets, and her death. But Arnaldo didn't scream for the guard. He didn't run to Anastasius. Instead, he knelt. But he didn't kneel like a subject to a pope. He knelt like a man who had found a goddess. Arnaldo became her domestic secret. She appointed him as her private chamberlain, the only man allowed to enter her inner sanctum. It was a move of desperate strategic genius. By making him her closest confidant, she bought his silence. But in doing so, she opened a door she had kept locked since she was 12 years old, the door to her own heart. This is where the legend takes a turn from political thriller to tragic romance. Do you think Arnaldo was a protector? Or was he the ultimate trap? Tell me in the comments. Can a secret this big survive a relationship? Your engagement helps us continue this epic saga. For 15 years, Joan had been an island. She had lived in a world where every touch was a threat and every word was a mask. But with Arnaldo, for the first time, she could breathe. Behind the locked doors of the papal apartments, away from the prying eyes of the Curia, the Pope could be a woman. But the Vatican is a place where walls have ears and shadows have eyes. The sudden promotion of a nameless groom to the position of papal chamberlain didn't go unnoticed. The whispers turned into roars. Anastasius began to spread rumors of a Greek sin, an unholy attraction between the Pope and his servant. Joan was trapped in a new kind of prison. If she dismissed Arnaldo, she risked his betrayal. If she kept him, she fueled the scandals that could topple her throne. She chose the latter, believing her intellect could manage the rumors just as it had managed the Frankish kings. But she forgot one thing: the body has a logic of its own. In the spring of 855, the marble pope began to change. The paleness that everyone thought was holiness began to turn into a sickly green. The iron energy that had rebuilt Rome began to flag. She found herself fainting during the long, incense-heavy masses. She thought it was the heat. She thought it was the stress. But one morning, as she tried to bind her chest for the daily audience, she realized that the bandages were no longer enough. The body she had suppressed, denied, and hidden for a decade and a half was finally rebelling. The Vicar of Christ was pregnant. Imagine the sheer, cold terror. A woman pregnant with the child of her servant while sitting on the throne of St. Peter, surrounded by enemies who were waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. Joan didn't panic. She used her medical knowledge to try and calculate the time she had left. She tried to find a way to disappear, to claim a pilgrimage or a seclusion for prayer. But the church was in a crisis. The Saracens were preparing a new assault. The people needed their pope. She was a prisoner of her own success. The world wouldn't let her go. She began to wear even larger robes. She avoided all public appearances that required her to stand for long periods. She turned her apartments into a fortress. But inside that fortress, the clock was ticking. Every heartbeat of the child inside her was a countdown to the end of the world. She had built a golden age for Rome, but she had built it on a foundation of glass, and the glass was starting to crack. We are approaching the most shocking climax in the history of the papacy. How do you think Joan plans to survive the next 9 months? Can she hide a pregnancy in the middle of the most public office on earth? Drop your theories in the comments. I'll be highlighting the most creative ones in the next part. As the Easter celebrations of 855 approached, the tension in Rome was palpable. Anastasius was preparing his final move. He had noticed the Pope's changing silhouette. He had noticed the way Arnaldo guarded the door with a sword in his hand and fear in his eyes. Joan stood before the mirror in her private chapel. She looked at the papal tiara glinting in the candlelight. She had ruled better than any man. She had brought peace, water, and knowledge to a dark world. But the world didn't care about her works. It only cared about her womb. "I am the Pope," she whispered to her reflection, "and God will have to decide if that is enough." The rain began to fall on Rome, a dark, ominous storm that the people said was a sign of the end times. Little did they know, the end was coming, not from the heavens, but from the very heart of the church. The great procession was only weeks away, the day Joan would have to walk the streets of Rome, under the eyes of thousands, while carrying a secret that was now kicking against her ribs. The reign of John VIII was about to meet the reality of Joan, and history was about to become a bloodbath. In the history of the Vatican, there are sins of gold and there are sins of blood, but in the spring of 855, Pope John VIII was committing a sin that the medieval world could not even find a name for. Inside the most sacred chambers of the Lateran Palace, protected by iron-bound doors and a single silent guard, the Vicar of Christ was loosening her bandages. For 15 years, Joan had been a masterpiece of stone and logic. But now, she was something far more dangerous. She was flesh. Every kick against her ribs was a reminder that her greatest victory, the total suppression of her womanhood, had been undone by a single moment of human longing. She was the ruler of the world, and she was a prisoner of her own womb. The relationship with Arnaldo, her chamberlain, wasn't just a romance. In the cold, cynical world of Rome, it was a survival pact. Arnaldo was the only person who touched her without a glove, the only soul who knew that the marble pope had a heart that beat with fear. But as her pregnancy progressed into its second trimester, the forbidden desire became a forbidden reality. Joan, the master of theological nuances, found herself unable to argue with the biology of her own body. The morning sickness was a daily war. She would sit on the throne, surrounded by the smell of heavy incense and the stale breath of aging cardinals, feeling the world spin. She used her holy asceticism as a cover. When she turned pale and nauseous, she claimed it was a divine vision or an ecstasy of the spirit. The people of Rome saw their pope becoming more frail, more ethereal, and they loved him even more for it. They thought the spirit was consuming the body. They had no idea the body was creating a life. Is it possible to be a good leader while living a total lie? Joan was giving Rome its golden age, yet her very existence was a subversion of the Church's laws. Tell me in the comments, does the end justify the means? Or was Joan's secret an unforgivable betrayal of the faithful? But while the people were blinded by devotion, Cardinal Anastasius was sharpened by hate. He noticed the changes that others missed. He noticed the way the Pope now walked with a slight protective hand over his stomach. He noticed that Arnaldo, the nameless groom, never left the Pope's side, sleeping like a dog across the threshold of the papal bedchamber. Anastasius began a campaign of psychological warfare. He would linger after the audiences, asking pointed questions about the Pope's swelling health. He brought in the most famous physicians from Salerno, insisting they examine the Holy Father for the good of Christendom. Joan outplayed them all. She cited the decree of privacy she had written herself years prior. She turned her bedroom into a fortress of prayer where no man, save Arnaldo, could enter. She was a genius of the closed loop, creating a reality where only she and her lover existed. But the stress was eroding her mind. At night, the Pope of Rome would weep into the shoulder of a servant. She wasn't weeping for her lost soul. She was weeping for the child who was born into a death sentence. What do you do with a papal baby? Do you spirit it away in the night? Do you claim a miracle? Or do you accept that the moment the child cries, the mother dies? The Roman calendar is a relentless machine of public ritual, and the greatest gear in that machine was the Easter procession, the Via Sacra. It was a grueling 3-mile walk from St. Peter's to the Lateran, under the blistering sun, through a sea of 100,000 screaming, reaching pilgrims. Joan looked at the date on the calendar. She was in her 8th month. Every advisor, Every cardinal and every king expected the Pope to lead the procession. To decline would be to signal a fatal weakness. It would invite an immediate coup by Anastasius. To go was to risk the impossible, going into labor in the middle of a Roman street. Arnaldo begged her to flee. "We have horses," he whispered in the dark. "We have the gold from your private chest. We can reach the coast, find a ship to the east. In Byzantium, you can be a woman again." Joan looked at the papal tiara sitting on its velvet cushion. She thought of the hospitals she had built, the peace she had brokered, the light she had brought to the Dark Ages. If she fled, everything she had built would be erased. Anastasius would take the throne, and the first thing he would do was tear down her walls and burn her books. "If I leave, the darkness returns," she said, her voice sounding like cold iron. "I started this as a girl who wanted to read. I will end it as a pope who refused to hide." Joan is choosing duty over safety, even as her body is screaming for mercy. Do you think this was an act of supreme courage or supreme arrogance? Write courage or arrogance in the comments. We are approaching the bloody climax of the legend. As the days grew longer and the air of Rome turned humid, Joan began her final deception. She ordered a new set of robes, heavier, stiffer, made of layers of gold brocade that could stand up on their own. It was a suit of armor designed to hide a protruding belly. She practiced her walk in the dead of night, Arnaldo holding her arm as she stumbled through the empty corridors of the Lateran. She learned to breathe in shallow gasps, her lungs crushed between the weight of the gold and the weight of the child. She was preparing for a miracle or a massacre. In the shadows, Anastasius was also preparing. He had bribed one of the lesser servants to watch the Pope's laundry. He was waiting for the blood. He was waiting for the slip. He knew the Easter procession was the moment the marble Pope would finally break. The stage was set. The city was decorated with palms and silk. The bells were ready to ring. And in the center of it all, a woman stood in front of a crucifix, praying to a God she had outsmarted for 15 years, asking for just 3 more miles of silence. But God, or perhaps history, was done with silence. The streets of Rome were narrow, the stones were uneven, and the sun was about to become her executioner. In the year 855, the most sacred secret in the world was hidden behind 4 layers of gold-woven silk and a heart made of cold, tempered steel. Pope John VIII, Joan, was no longer just a ruler. She was a ticking time bomb of biology. Every morning, as the bells of the Lateran Palace called the faithful to prayer, the Vicar of Christ was engaged in a brutal ritual of self-inflicted torture. The bandages that had once been a simple tool of disguise were now an instrument of agony. At 9 months pregnant, Joan was attempting to compress a life into a shadow. It was a war against nature that no one had ever won, and the battlefield was her own body. Imagine the heat of a Roman spring, heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the stench of the Tiber. Inside the papal apartments, the air was stagnant. Joan stood before a triptych mirror, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Arnaldo, his hands trembling, pulled the linen strips tighter. The pain was a white-hot scream behind her eyes. Her ribs felt as if they were being crushed by an invisible vice. But she didn't tell him to stop. She couldn't. If she allowed her silhouette to soften by even an inch, the sharp-eyed eunuchs and the bitter Cardinal Anastasius would see the truth before she ever reached the altar. She had become an architect of her own skin. She ordered her tailors, men who were forbidden from touching the Holy Father, to create robes with stiff, internal structures of whalebone and boiled leather. It was a papal exoskeleton, designed to keep her upright when her legs wanted to buckle and to keep her flat when her womb wanted to swell. Can you imagine the sheer willpower required to lead a global empire while your body is literally breaking apart? Joan's story is a testament to the lengths humans will go to for power or for a cause they believe in. If you're gripped by this struggle between the spirit and the flesh, hit that like button. We are witnessing the most high-stakes masquerade in history. The Lateran Palace had become a house of mirrors. Joan saw spies in every shadow. She convinced herself that the scent of milk and blood followed her through the corridors, despite the heavy clouds of frankincense she ordered to be burned at all times. One afternoon, Cardinal Anastasius forced his way into the Pope's private study. He didn't come with a dagger. He came with a gift, a rare, heavy wool cloak from the north, claiming the Pope looked chilled. As he draped it over her shoulders, his hand brushed against her side. Joan didn't flinch. She used the papal stare, a look of such cold, icy divinity that it had made kings tremble. "Your concern for our health is noted, Cardinal," she whispered, her voice like grinding stone. "But perhaps you should spend more time tending to the health of your own soul." Anastasius retreated, but the look in his eyes was one of predatory satisfaction. He hadn't felt the softness of a woman, but he had felt the tension. He knew the marble Pope was made of glass, and he was waiting for the first crack. But the biggest threat wasn't a cardinal. It was the child. Joan could feel the movements, vigorous, rhythmic, and terrifyingly frequent. She began to talk to the child in the dark of night, a desperate, whispered negotiation between a mother and a stowaway. "Not yet," she would pray. "Just 3 more days. Give me 3 more miles." In the 9th century, childbirth was a death sentence for many women, even in the best conditions. For a woman who had to give birth in secret, without a midwife, while pretending to be a man, it was a suicide mission. Arnaldo had gathered what he could: clean linens, sharp blades hidden in a Bible box, and herbs to dull the pain. But he was a groom, not a physician. He looked at Joan, the leader of the Western world, and saw a terrified girl drowning in silk. Joan, ever the scholar, had read the medical texts of Soranus and Galen. She knew the signs of the descending. She knew that her body was preparing for a climax that no decree could postpone. She began to draft her final will, not as John VIII, but as Joan of Ingelheim. She left her few personal books to the school in Athens and her brother's old tunic to a nameless charity. She was preparing for her own funeral, even as she prepared for a birth. Was Joan a hero for staying to protect her legacy, or was she a monster for risking her child's life for a throne? The comments are a battlefield on this one. Tell me where you stand. Is there such a thing as a noble lie? Or is the truth always the higher path? The eve of the great procession arrived. Rome was electric. Thousands of pilgrims had slept in the streets, their campfires lighting up the ruins like a fallen galaxy. They were waiting to see the saintly Pope carry the relics from St. Peter's to the Lateran. Joan sat alone in her chapel. She had refused to eat for 3 days, hoping to shrink her body as much as possible. She was so thin that her face looked like a skull wrapped in translucent parchment. She looked up at the crucifix. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't pray as a scholar or a pope. She prayed as a mother. She asked for the strength to walk those 3 miles. She asked that the rain would keep the crowds at a distance. She asked for a miracle of silence. But as she stood up to prepare for the dawn, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her abdomen, not the dull ache of the bandages, but something deeper, something rhythmic. Her water had not broken, but the first contraction had arrived. It was 12 hours until the procession. 12 hours to the Via Sacra. She gripped the edge of the altar until her knuckles turned white. "Not now," she hissed into the empty chapel. "Not yet." The sun rose over the 7 hills, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Arnaldo entered the room, his face as pale as a shroud. He saw Joan sitting on the edge of the bed, her heavy gold robes already laid out like a golden coffin. "The contractions. They are coming every hour," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We must cancel. We must claim a sudden fever." Joan looked at him, and for a moment the mask of the Pope slipped. He saw the girl from Ingelheim, the one who had cut her hair in the mud. "If I do not walk today, Anastasius takes the throne by sunset," she said. "If I do not walk, every book I saved, every child I fed, and every peace I made is burned. I will walk, even if I have to walk on my own blood." They began the long process of dressing her, the layers of linen, the boiled leather corset, the wool tunics, the silk dalmatic, and finally the heavy golden cope. When they were finished, Joan could barely move. She was a statue of gold and bone. She stepped out into the hallway. The papal guard snapped to attention. The cardinals bowed. Anastasius stood at the front, his eyes narrowed, searching for a tremor in her hand. Joan didn't tremble. She took the heavy silver cross in her hands and felt another contraction ripple through her body. She pushed the pain into a dark corner of her mind and stepped out into the blinding Roman sun. The 3 miles were waiting, and history was watching. The sun of Rome is not a blessing, it is a witness. On that fateful morning of the Rogation Day procession in 855, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who choked the narrow streets. They were there to see a god. They were there to touch the hem of the robe of Pope John VIII, the marble saint who had rebuilt their city. But as the heavy gold-encrusted sedia gestatoria, the papal throne, was hoisted onto the shoulders of the bearers, the man sitting upon it was dying. Inside that golden exoskeleton, behind the layers of silk and the whalebone corset, a woman was in the final stages of labor. Every step of the procession was a rhythmic torture. Every cheer from the crowd was a knife in her ears. Joan was no longer the vicar of Christ. She was a mother trapped in a golden coffin, walking toward her own execution. The route was 3 miles long, the Via Sacra. It stretched from the majesty of St. Peter's Basilica, through the heart of the ancient ruins, past the Colosseum, and toward the Lateran Palace. Under normal circumstances, it was a triumph. Today, it was a gauntlet of fire. Joan sat perfectly still. Her face was a mask of cold, translucent marble. Only her eyes, dilated with pain and terror, betrayed the war inside. Under the heavy robes, her hands were gripped so tightly around the silver crucifix that her palms began to bleed. A contraction hit her just as the procession reached the Forum. It was a wave of primordial agony that threatened to tear her in two. Her breath hitched. The throne tilted slightly. For a second, the world held its breath. "Holy Father, are you unwell?" whispered Cardinal Anastasius, who was walking just inches away, his eyes narrowed like a vulture watching a dying animal. Joan didn't look at him. She couldn't. She forced her voice into a low, vibrating growl, the voice of a pope, forged in the schools of Athens. "The spirit is heavy with the sins of this city, Cardinal. Keep walking." Can you imagine the level of psychological and physical discipline required to hide a scream while your body is literally forcing a life into the world. Joan's endurance is one of the most incredible feats in human history, whether you believe the legend or not. If you're gripped by this final walk, hit that like button. We are about to witness the moment the world broke. The procession turned onto the narrow street between the Colosseum and the Basilica of St. Clement. The crowds here were denser, the air stagnant and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and burning myrrh. The heat was trapped between the stone walls, creating a furnace. The jolt of the crowd sent a shockwave through the throne. And in that moment, the final barrier broke. Joan felt a warm, terrifying rush of fluid under her layers of wool. Her water had broken. The scent of life, visceral, metallic, and undeniable, began to compete with the heavy clouds of incense. The papal guards looked at each other confused. Arnaldo, walking behind the throne, turned white as a shroud. He moved closer, trying to shield her with his own body, but he was just one man against the gaze of history. Another contraction arrived. This one wasn't a wave. It was an earthquake. Joan's body arched involuntarily. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound so primal it silenced the chanting monks nearby. "Stop the procession!" Anastasius roared, sensing the kill. "The Pope is possessed! The Pope is falling!" The bearers, confused and frightened, lowered the sedia gestatoria to the uneven cobblestones. The gold robes billowed out. Joan tried to stand, her hand reaching for the air, her papal tiara slipping from her head and clattering onto the stones, the gold denting, the gems scattering like fallen stars. She fell to her knees in the middle of the street. The crowd pressed in, screaming in terror. They thought their pope was dying of a stroke or a curse. But as the heavy scarlet and gold robes were pushed aside by the frantic hands of the cardinals, the world stopped spinning. The sound was a thunderbolt. It was the one sound that was impossible in the heart of the Vatican. The cardinals scrambled back in horror. Anastasius stood paralyzed, his mouth open in a silent scream of triumph and disgust. There, on the dirty stones of the Via Sacra, surrounded by the ruins of the Roman Empire and the symbols of God's power, lay the Pope. Her legs were spread. The white silk of her inner tunic was soaked in blood. And in the mud and the dust, a child was gasping its first breath of Roman air. This is the moment that changed everything. The Vicar of Christ had just given birth. Imagine being a pilgrim in that crowd. One second you're worshiping a saint, the next you're witnessing the ultimate blasphemy. What would your reaction be? Fear, anger, or awe? Let me know in the comments. The silence didn't last. In the 9th century, mystery was usually answered with violence. The shock of the crowd turned, in a heartbeat, into a murderous rage. They felt cheated. They felt cursed. They saw the woman who had fed them, healed them, and ruled them not as a hero, but as a demon who had defiled the holy throne. "Prostituta!" someone screamed. "Witch! Deceiver!" The accounts of what happened next vary in their brutality, but all end in blood. Some say the angry mob tied Joan's feet to the tails of horses and dragged her through the streets until her body was a shapeless mass. Others say they stoned her and the child on the spot, burying them where they fell. But the most tragic version is the simplest. Joan looked down at the child, the son she had hidden for 9 months, the child who had cost her everything, and she smiled. She had done it. She had proven that a woman could reach the stars. And then, her heart, exhausted by 15 years of lying and 3 miles of agony, simply stopped. She died in the dust, a pope without a crown, a mother without a future. The Vatican's reaction was swifter than the mob's. Within hours, the child was gone. Some say killed, others say whisked away to a secret monastery to live out his life in shadow. Anastasius finally had his path to the throne, but he was left with a church in ruins. To save the papacy, they had to erase the person. They couldn't just kill her. They had to unmake her. They began the Damnatio Memoriae. They chipped her name off the monuments. They burned her decrees. They even built a roof over that specific part of the street so that no pope would ever have to look at the ground where she bled. But they couldn't stop the stones from remembering. For 500 years, every time a new pope was crowned, he would reach the street of St. Clement, and his horse would be led on a long, humiliating detour. Why? Because the church was terrified that if a pope walked over Joan's ghost, the ground might open up and swallow the truth again. Joan died on that street, but her legend was born there. Do you believe the Vatican successfully erased her? Or is the fact that we're still talking about her today the ultimate proof of her victory? Drop a legend if you think she's a myth, or history if you think she was real. As the sun set over Rome on that day in 855, the blood on the stones was washed away by a sudden, violent rainstorm. The people returned to their homes, whispering of the woman pope. Joan of Ingelheim was gone. John VIII was a name to be given to someone else, a real man, to fill the gap in the records. But the throne of St. Peter would never be the same. The next time a man sat on that chair, he would have to prove his gender in a way that was as bizarre as it was humiliating, all because of the girl who dared to read and the woman who dared to rule. The procession was over. But the investigation into the chair of inquiry and the secret evidence left behind is just beginning. The blood on the stones of the Via Sacra was still warm when the machinery of silence began to turn. In the eyes of 9th century Rome, Pope Joan was not a fallen leader. She was a cosmic glitch, a biological blasphemy that threatened the very fabric of the universe. The wrath of God had been delivered through the hands of the mob, but the wrath of man was just beginning. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her to have never been born. History, when written by enemies, is a collection of horrific possibilities. Because the Vatican worked so hard to erase the official record, we are left with 3 competing bloody accounts of Joan's final moments. The first, and most common account, is the stoning. As the baby's cry pierced the air, the shock of the pilgrims turned into a holy frenzy. They saw the woman who had just led them in prayer as a demon in silk. They didn't wait for a trial. They didn't wait for a decree. They picked up the jagged paving stones of the Roman street and rained them down upon the mother and child. Some chroniclers say they were buried alive on that very spot, the earth forced into their mouths to silence the blasphemous cries of the infant. The second account is the drag. This version, favored by the darker medieval legends, claims that Cardinal Anastasius, now effectively in control, ordered her feet to be tied to the tails of 2 wild stallions. She was dragged through the streets of Rome, her papal robe shredding against the ruins of the empire, until there was nothing left of the woman who had ruled the world. The third, and perhaps most chilling version, is the living death. In this account, Joan survived the birth, but was whisked away to a secret dungeon beneath the Lateran. There, she was forced to watch her child be taken away, never to be seen again, before being quietly disposed of by the Pope's own physicians. But no matter how she died, the mystery of her grave remains. There is a spot in Rome, between the Colosseum and St. Clement's, where a small shrine once stood. On it was an inscription that terrified the church for centuries: Petra, pater patrum, papis prodito partum. Peter, father of fathers, betray the childbirth of the woman pope. Which version do you think is more likely? Was it a spontaneous riot, or a cold, calculated execution by her rivals? Let me know in the comments. Your theories help us navigate the fog of the Dark Ages. But killing the woman was only half the battle. The church now faced a crisis of legitimacy. If Joan was a pope, then every bishop she ordained, every law she signed, and every soul she blessed was technically a lie. To save the institution, they had to perform a documentary execution, damnatio memoriae. The scribes were sent into the archives. They didn't just burn her records. They practiced a form of medieval Photoshop. They scraped her name off the lists of popes, leaving ghostly, blank spaces that are still visible in ancient manuscripts today. They renamed her John VIII, and then assigned that name to another man, a later pope, to fill the gap and make the timeline seamless. Statues that looked too feminine were smashed or recarved to have beards. The great hospitals she built were renamed after male saints. The golden age of her reign was credited to the men who came before and after her. But you cannot kill a memory in a city as old as Rome. For 500 years, the street where she gave birth, the Vicus Papissa, became a place of terror for the papacy. Every year, for 5 centuries, the official papal processions would reach that specific corner and come to a dead stop. Even the most powerful popes, men who commanded armies, would humble themselves by turning their horses around and taking a long, winding detour through the mud to avoid that single stretch of cobblestone. They said it was because the street was too narrow. They said it was because of the traffic. But the Romans knew better. They knew the church was afraid that if the real pope walked over, if the church was so sure she was a myth, why did they avoid that street for 500 years? Was it out of respect, or a deep-seated fear of her ghost? Write fear or respect in the comments. I'm curious to see your take on this historical detour. The final part of the wrath was the most humiliating. To ensure that another Joan could never happen, the Vatican instituted the most bizarre ritual in the history of religion, the Cella Stercoraria. We will explore this in detail in our final chapter, the Chair of Inquiry. A ritual so strange that even today, the Vatican refuses to discuss it. It was the moment where the most powerful man on earth had to sit on a hole in a chair and prove, through a physical touch, that he was indeed a man. Joan was gone, but she had forced the church to look at its own anatomy. She had turned the throne of God into a place of biological checking. As the sun set on that bloody day in 855, Anastasius stood in the Lateran, looking at the empty chair of Peter. He had won. But as he looked at the bloodstains still visible on the white marble floor, he realized that he hadn't just killed a woman. He had created a legend that would haunt the church until the end of time. History is often thought of as a solid, immovable mountain of facts. But in the secret halls of the 9th century Vatican, history was as fluid as ink and as fragile as parchment. When Pope Joan fell in the mud of the Via Sacra, the church didn't just have a scandal, they had an existential threat. If a woman had held the keys of heaven, the entire divine hierarchy of the Middle Ages was a lie. To save the institution, they had to perform the ultimate act of intellectual violence, damnatio memoriae, the total condemnation of her memory. But as any detective will tell you, the harder you try to hide a body, the more clues you leave behind. The primary weapon in this war against memory was the quill. The Liber Pontificalis, the official book of the popes, was the Church's autobiography. After the events of 855, teams of scribes were ordered to correct the timeline. In the ancient manuscripts that survived, we see the evidence of their work. There are palimpsests, pages where the original text was scraped away with a knife so that new, correct history could be written over it. If you hold these pages up to a specific frequency of light today, you can still see the ghostly indentations of the words they tried to kill. The gap between Leo IV and Benedict III was filled with a flurry of administrative lies. They shortened the reigns, shifted the dates, and hoped that the world would simply forget the 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days that Joan sat on the throne. Do you believe that an organization with enough power can truly delete a person from history, or does the truth always leave a digital footprint even in the age of ink? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever found a gap in history that felt too perfect to be true? The most clever part of the erasure was the John problem. By the mid-9th century, there had been 7 popes named John. Joan had taken the name John VIII. To erase her, the Church simply skipped a beat. When the next legitimate man named John took the throne years later, he was also named John VIII. It was a brilliant piece of gaslighting. By doubling the number, they made it so that any future historian looking for John VIII would find a man, not a woman. They created a chronological smokescreen, but even here, they stumbled. Medieval chroniclers like Jean de Mailly and Martin of Opava, men who were high-ranking officials with access to the real archives, couldn't keep the secret. Martin of Opava, the personal chaplain to several popes, wrote in his Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum that a certain John, an Englishman, had been elected pope and was later found to be a woman. Why would a man in his position risk his life to write a lie? He wouldn't. He was recording what the archives still whispered before they were completely purged. You can burn books, but it's much harder to burn a city. Rome is a museum of Joan's existence. Take the Cathedral of Siena. There, in the long line of terracotta busts of the popes, Joan's face once sat proudly among the others. It remained there for over 600 years, until Pope Clement VIII, in a fit of post-Reformation panic, ordered it to be destroyed and replaced with a bust of Pope Zachary. And then there is the Bernini canopy in St. Peter's Basilica. If you look closely at the marble plinths, there are carvings of a woman's face in the throes of labor. For centuries, the Church has claimed they represent the niece of the Pope who commissioned the work. But why would the most sacred altar in Christendom feature a woman giving birth? Scholars suggest Bernini, a master of secrets, was leaving a permanent stone tribute to the forbidden pope, hidden in plain sight of the very men who tried to erase her. If you were an artist tasked with hiding a forbidden truth in a church, how would you do it? Joan's story survived through these Easter eggs in art and architecture. If you're enjoying this historical detective work, make sure to subscribe. We're about to uncover the most physical proof of all. The most damning evidence of the damnatio memoriae was the detour of shame. For 5 centuries, every papal procession, the most public and grandiose events in Rome, would take a long, winding, and highly inconvenient detour to avoid the street of St. Clement. If Joan was a myth, why did the Church treat that specific patch of dirt like it was radioactive? Why did they build a wall to block the view of the spot where she fell? It wasn't until the 16th century, during the height of the Protestant Reformation, that the Church finally realized the detour was proving the Protestants right. They finally ordered the processions to walk the straight line again, desperately trying to prove that there was nothing to see here. But the damage was done. The silence was too loud. The erasure was too visible. The very efforts to forget Joan became the monuments that helped us remember her. But there was one ritual they couldn't just stop. It was the physical check. The moment where every man who wanted the throne had to prove he wasn't another Joan. Even today, in the Vatican secret archives, there are files that remain reserved. Historians who have glimpsed the 9th century records speak of strange marginalia, notes written in the 15th and 16th centuries by fearful bishops, warning researchers to ignore the fables of the woman. If she was a fable, why the warning? You don't warn people about things that don't exist. You warn them about things that might be true. Joan's Damnatio Memoriae failed because she had become more than a person. She had become a symbol. She was the ghost that reminded the Vatican that the divine order was a fragile human construction. They tried to bury her in the mud, but they only succeeded in planting a seed that would sprout into one of the greatest mysteries of the human race. The ink has dried. The statues have been replaced, but the chair of inquiry is still waiting, and in our final chapter, we will sit in it. The ultimate proof of a secret is not what is said, but what is done. For over 500 years, every time a man was elected to the highest office on earth, he had to endure a moment of profound, cold humiliation. He wasn't asked about his faith. He wasn't asked about his politics. He was asked to sit on a chair of red porphyry marble with a hole carved into its center. This was the Cella Stercoraria, and its purpose was as simple as it was shocking: to ensure that the man who claimed the keys of heaven was actually a man. If Pope Joan was a Protestant fairy tale, why did the Vatican create a ritual to ensure she could never happen again? The ritual was a masterpiece of medieval pragmatism. After the election in the conclave, the new Pope-elect would be led to the Lateran Basilica. There, in front of a select group of high-ranking clergy, he would sit upon the pierced chair. A young cardinal deacon would reach beneath the seat, through the hole in the marble, and perform a physical examination of the Pope's genitals. It was a manual verification of gender. Once the check was complete, the deacon would stand and announce to the waiting room in a loud, clear voice, "Testiculos habet et bene pendentes." He has testicles, and they hang well. "Thanks be to God," the clergy would reply. Only then was the Pope considered truly Vicar of Christ. For centuries, this wasn't a joke or a rumor. It was a mandatory part of the papal coronation, documented by historians like Felix Hemmerlin and referenced in the diaries of pilgrims who visited the Vatican and saw the chairs with their own eyes. Can you imagine the Pope, the most powerful man in Europe, having to go through a gender check before he could receive his crown? This ritual existed because the Church was terrified. They had been fooled once by a woman's mind, and they were determined never to be fooled by a woman's body again. If you think this ritual is the smoking gun of Joan's existence, hit that like button. It's a piece of history they'd rather we forget. The Vatican today denies the ritual ever took place. They claim the Cella Stercoraria was just an ancient Roman toilet or a ceremonial throne of humility. But if they were just toilets, why are they made of the rarest red marble reserved only for emperors? And why are two of these chairs still in existence today, one in the Vatican museums and another in the Louvre in Paris? When you look at these chairs, you aren't just looking at marble. You are looking at a scar in the history of the papacy. You are looking at the physical manifestation of a 500-year-old paranoia. The Church doesn't keep toilets in its most sacred museums. It keeps artifacts of its survival. Joan was erased from the books, but she was written into the very DNA of the institution. She forced the Church to define itself through exclusion. But what did she leave behind, besides a pierced chair and a bloody street? She left behind a crack in the wall of the Dark Ages. Joan was a pioneer of the mind. She proved that knowledge has no gender, and that a girl with a book is more powerful than an army of kings. She ruled better than the men who came before her, and the men who came after. She brought peace to a fractured Europe and water to a dying Rome. Her sin wasn't that she was a woman. It was that she was better than the men who claimed a monopoly on God's grace. Her story persists not because it is a myth, but because it is an archetype. She is the shadow that reminds every power structure that the truth cannot be permanently buried. Even now, in the 21st century, the name of Joan still causes a nervous stir in the halls of the Vatican. Why? Because as long as her story is told, the perfect chain of male succession remains broken. Is Pope Joan a legend or a suppressed truth? After journeying through her life, her reign, and her brutal end, what do you believe? Write fact or fiction in the comments. This is your chance to cast your vote in the jury of history. As we look back at the 9th century, through the fog of censorship and the mud of Rome, we see her. We see the girl in Ingelheim cutting her hair. We see the scholar in Athens arguing with philosophers. We see the Pope on the throne, hiding a heartbeat under a golden robe. Joan didn't lose. She may have died in the dust, but she conquered the highest office in the world. She achieved the impossible, and in doing so, she became immortal. History is a forest of whispers. Some whispers are louder than others, and the whisper of Joan, the woman who became God, is a roar that the stones of Rome will never forget. The archives are closed. The processions have changed their route, but the chair is still there, and the ghost of Joan is still watching. Thank you for journeying with us through the shadows of the Vatican. If you want to uncover more of history's forbidden truths, subscribe and stay in the light. Until next time, remember, the past is never dead. It's not even past.